Thank you, Ming. Thank you, Diana and Amara. And Diana, what you've put up here in Dhaka is really, it's a visionary experiment that you've conducted by bringing together not only your exhibition, but in a very collegial manner, inviting other curators from the larger Asian context to put together this, what I can only call a spectacular, magnificent effort. So thank you for inviting me here. And the topic for today, as Ming said, is Between the High Altitude View and the Detail, a study of 2 decades of American painting. I hope you don't mind if I begin on a personal note. A cold coming I had of it. I was born on 15 December 1971 during the Bangladesh Liberation War. A day later, the Pakistani armed forces surrendered in Dhaka and the war came to an end. Light could be fatal. Black paper covered all the windows in Bombay. I was pushed out into the world in the flickering shadows thrown by Petromax lanterns. Bangladesh has always been a part of my mythos, a mythos stained in dark colors, like a black painting with a gradually visible red edge. I sense fear before I knew how to spell the word, violence before I saw photographs of mass graves, silence because genocidal rape was yet to be acknowledged, independence as a new life yet to be explored. Here I stand before you in Dhaka, my fate uncannily linked with that of your young nations through an accident of birth. You might as well ask, what does a newborn's cry and the birth of a neighboring nation have to do with the thematic displays of internationalism? Well, among other things, it tells us that strict territorial demarcations and nationalist conceptions often falter at intersections where the faiths of nations, young and not so young, get entangled and become entwined. That fear travels simultaneously both down south and up north. That misunderstanding is not something that we casually disown and leave in front of the other's door. It is something opaque, like ignorance, that we fail to recognize about ourselves. That empathy is a form of clarity when the distinction between the self and the other is not so distinct. Next slide, please. But now I speak in riddles. Let me reach for a specific example. My paper today will explore the political circumstances of the Cold War and the global cultural circulations that surrounded the late 1960s traveling exhibition, 2 Decades of American Painting, which was organized by MoMA, New York, and supported by its International Council. This exhibition toured the world under the aegis of the State Department and was a US soft power initiative. Originally intended for presentation in Tokyo, Kyoto, and New Delhi, its itinerary was expanded to include Melbourne and Sydney, significantly in a period when the Vietnam War was underway, China's nuclear ambitions had become clear, and the US-USSR confrontation was being played out in various theaters. In the study of exhibitionary exchanges during the Cold War, the emphasis is either on the political and cultural hegemony of the superpowers or on the resistance of the recipient societies to such domination. But both approaches begin with presumptions about the self and the other. West and East, more or less, remain unshifting categories in such a discourse. By contrast, my focus here will be on the agency of such individual cultural actors as artists, art critics, and curators, rather than on the official scripts of cultural diplomacy or curatorial policy. I will excavate the reception history of 2 decades of American painting in Delhi, 1967, and argue that while not affecting the content of post-colonial Indian art, it challenged Indian artists and art critics to revisit and critically recast the terms of their debate, including such key and contested themes as cultural identity and artistic autonomy, tradition and modernity, abstraction and counter-abstractionist strategies, the creation of a universal canon, the establishment of a nation-style painting, national-style painting, forgive me. And specifically, I will examine the rhetoricity, the overt speech acts, as well as the covert dialogues that characterize the reviews of the show by Indian artists and critics. Equally, I will dwell on the preoccupations and motivations of individual figures, the American curator Waldo Rasmussen and the American art critic Lucy Lippert, who were involved in the exhibition. And the reason why I also I don't want to just do a reception history of 2 decades of American painting in India, but also look at the predicaments and the dilemmas of the curators who brought the show to us, is that it's important to not just look at macro level abstractions, but to relook at the center-periphery question afresh from a trans-cultural perspective. And to try and understand, as I said, the predicament of actors on both sides of the Cold War divide. Next slide, please. Almost half of 2 decades of American painting consisted of post-war New York school paintings labeled as abstract expressionist or action painting, a tendency that had begun in the mid-40s. The exhibition also included paintings embodying various early and mid-50s movements of artistic reaction to abstract expressionism, for instance, pop art, op, post-pop. However, the curator of the show, Waldo Rasmussen, underlined the contemporaneity of the works. The senior-most artist in the show, for example, Joseph Albers, next slide please, was represented by his most recent works made in 1966, and many of the other artists' works had been made during the 50s and the 60s. Next slide, please. In his curatorial preface, Rasmussen insisted that the exhibition was not to be regarded as an official view of recent American art, and that it reflected his individual biases and aesthetic judgment. Nevertheless, he affirmed, and I quote him, that the abstract expressionist movement had been the most important development in modern art since Cubism, close quote. The hub of the international art world had already moved from Paris to New York 2 decades before, but with this exhibition, the hegemonic power of European art was once and for all displaced by the ascendancy of the New York school, a coup that was granted the seal of institutional legitimacy. According to the USIS Nippo Delhi document, the show received mixed reactions. Indian artists and critics in general found the show simply delightful and exciting, while the audience by and large found it astonishing, scandalous, and even boring. Next slide, please. Whether it is the unnamed Times of India critic or the artist Krishan Khanna writing for the Weekend Review, the reviews of the show by and large exuded the Indian writer's confidence to play witness to the contents of the show and even express reservations where required. On a first reading, Khanna's review seems to provide a magisterial overview of the exhibition with a clear-sighted historical contextualization of new American painting. He questions the popular notion that American artists lacked a tradition by pointing out that their tradition was dominated by European art until the outbreak of the Second World War, at which point Europe was devastated and the Americans felt liberated to invent their own language. At the same time, European artists who had emigrated to America were responsible for catalyzing the new scene. But such insights could have been provided by a competent American art critic writing about their own scene as well. What makes Khanna's framing distinctive is not what he's saying, but where he's saying from, the location from which he speaks, and the perceived audience to which he addresses his thoughts. He's speaking simultaneously to the Indian reader-viewer and to the American curators and critics. To his Indian readers, he provides information and insight. To the American curators, he establishes his discursive authority not as an apologist of the Indian art, not as an apologist for Indian art, but as someone who authoritatively discusses the American art scene. Importantly, he dissolves the idea that the Indian art situation is an exotic one with no connection to the American situation. Instead, he concentrates on the crises and challenges that confront post-war artists both in America and India. Adroitly, he does so without mentioning India or the Indian art scene even once. Khanna lobs the ball back into the West's court. Conventionally, it is the West that scrutinizes and judges modern Indian art as derivative, upholds Indian tradition as sacred, and decries our modernism as unresolved. Krishan Khanna poses similar questions in the American art context, but objectively and not through prejudiced lenses. Although Khanna does not phrase it so, I would surmise that he probably saw the American art situation as part of a globalization produced by the Second World War, when people across continents were exposed to both new discontents and new philosophies. This post-war globalization, if you will, pertained to both the East and the West. Just as Indians were looking to the West, Americans too were looking to Eastern religions and philosophy. Towards the end of the review, Khanna's interpretation of the show elaborates on the account of the worlding of the American artists. He cites Mark Tobey's work, next slide please, which displays influences of Zen philosophy and what he calls questionably Oriental art. Next slide please. And he asks whether Klein's Shenandoah Wall was possible without his awareness of Japanese or Chinese calligraphy. Importantly, Khanna does not reduce Klein or Tobey to their Eastern influences in an Oriental versus Occidental tit for tat. Rather, he makes a silent plea for the acknowledgement of the other within the self by showing that, despite its claims to historical uniqueness, new American painting's fate was entangled with visual regimes other than its own. Next slide, please. In the same spirit of focusing on the demonstrated rather than the stated, I would attend to the art critic and curator Lucy Lippert's essay in the Catalogue of 2 Decades. In American painting, the cult of the direct and the difficult, next slide, please, Lippert argues that one of the main features of new American painting is augmented presence. The confrontational directness of an object placed unavoidably and implacably in front of the spectator, close quote. These large-scale works are not meant to provide the viewer sensuous pleasure. They are meant to overwhelm first and to please or distract second, if at all. Instructively, while Lippert's essay relates the masculinist fantasy of new American painting to overwhelm, dwarf, and conquer, her own nascent curatorial preoccupations were moving in quite another direction. Next slide, please. In 1966, even as 2 Decades was showing in Tokyo, Lippert curated eccentric abstraction, presenting works that were subverting the program of minimalism by giving the structured and repetitive look a sensuous edge. Eccentric abstraction included the works of women artists like Eva Hesse and Louise Bourgeois, Alice Adams, who would gradually come into their own. The show drew a lot of attention because it was curated by a woman critic, which was unusual in those days. Next slide, please. With the exception of Helen Frankenthaler's work in 2 Decades, and her work is known for its soak stain technique, what was foregrounded in the American painting exhibition was a muscular wrestling with paint. Next slide, please. As against this, Eva Hesse's work in eccentric abstraction paved the way for vulnerability in art, which would soon become, as Lippert says, an important issue with women's art. Thus, in 1967, while repeating the official view on new American painting, Lippert was already articulating her own feminist concerns and aesthetic inclinations, which far exceeded the boundaries of the show. To see all Western curators as embodying a homogeneous Western stance is as unproductive as seeing modern Indian art through the Orientalist lens. Next slide, please. By the time Clement Greenberg, the Pope of American type painting, visited India in 1967 to participate in the symposium accompanying 2 decades, his idea of a medium-specific art was already losing ground. In India, of course, he retained the authority of the Western guru. Greenberg's exchanges with Indian critics constituted, if I may call it, a non-dialogue of the deaf. Critics like Krishan Lal Sodhi sought unproductively to measure American art against traditional Indian artistic ideals, which is itself a construct. To this, Greenberg responded with equal ignorance, claiming that traditional Indian pictorial art had died 100 years ago. The voice of sanity, as usual, was Khanna's. He refused to believe that American painting was universal, observing that, and I quote, "A lot of it is terribly local." Next slide, please. Like Khanna, the artist Gieve Patel was sensitive to nuance and resisted submission to the universal canon of New American painting. In his review of the Symposium for Contra, edited by the artist J. Swaminathan, Patel quickly unraveled the myth of a consensually stabilized and accepted national style by showing how the two Americans, Greenberg and the curator Rasmussen, did not see eye to eye on the selection of artists. To Rasmussen's growing discomfort at the symposium, Greenberg praised only the first generation of abstract expressionists. The rest were just about damned with faint praise. Next slide, please. Perplexed as he was by this, Patel nevertheless sought answers to pressing issues such as the possibility of internationalism, the portability of internationalism, but also the possibility of internationalism, the exportability of art, the overweening critical and curatorial power over the exigencies of artistic practice, and the question that he asks in the review, which is, how do you make exportable art without at the same time degrading it? Next slide, please. Neither Khanna nor Patel, both astute interpreters of the universal canon, betray in their writing a familiarity with the Cold War and its machinations in producing an official internationalism. Nowhere does either the artist refer to India's non-aligned position, its refusal to join US military interventions in Vietnam, its belief in the project of decolonization, and its respect for the sovereignty of all nations. Many of the questions that preoccupied Patel regarding the claims being made for the New York School's abstract expressionism as a universal language of art could have been answered within the framework of the Cold War and its superpower rivalry for attention of countries like India. Although India was non-aligned, it leaned towards Russia. There was a definite political agenda behind traveling 2 decades of India as a potential ally as a potential ally and a frontline state against communist and nuclear-capable China. Perhaps the Indian art world's conservatism regarding to materials, mediums, and formats ironically came to its rescue. It was not ready to ape the abstract expressionists. The Indian idea of abstraction was still comfortably within the clay Kandinsky realm. Large-scale canvases would not be emulated because at a subconscious level, perhaps, those canvases may have sent out the message to the viewer that one man's freedom is another man's captivity. India had been free only for 2 decades, and it was not ready to be overpowered and recolonized. Next slide, please. I would like to conclude with what Rasmussen said in his interview for the MoMA Oral History Project, and I quote him. I was born in 1928 in a small town near Spokane, Washington. My father was part American Indian, and I'm a member of that same tribe, the Kerr, the Elan tribe in Idaho, close quote. Rasmussen grew up during the Depression and his family was working class. His first museum visit only happened when he was 14. And I quote him, "It made me understand what it feels like to see exhibitions and original works of art for the first time after having seen them as reproductions only, away from the center," close quote. And he also said that this experience shaped the way in which he worked. While Rasmussen may have towed the official line as a director of circulating exhibitions of MoMA, he nevertheless felt a deep empathy for those who did not inhabit the center. There are peripheries even within the center, and some people are able to budge the center, even if by a little. Thank you.